As a park ranger stationed deep in the heart of Yosemite National Park, I thought I had seen it all. Over the years, I'd encountered wild creatures, odd storms, and the occasional lost hiker whose ramblings were more unsettling than the silence of the woods. But this was different. I hadn't known how wrong I was, how unprepared, until the first time I saw it. My watch had just struck midnight, the forest a wall of shadow stretching endlessly under a sky veiled in mist. I was doing my last rounds of the night, winding down the narrow path that bordered the lake's edge, when I noticed something odd, a smear of red across the underbrush. At first, I thought it was some injured animal. Things like that happened out here. But as I approached, the scene became clear. It wasn't just blood. It was ritualistic. Bodies, animal bodies, laid out in strange, disconcerting patterns, as if something had deliberately posed them there, their fur matted with streaks of blood. A shiver worked its way up my spine, but I swallowed down the dread, telling myself it was a predator. Probably just a predator. Maybe a bear had gone rabid. It wasn't unheard of. I convinced myself of this because the alternative, something else, something malicious lurking in these woods, was too absurd, even for my overactive imagination. But then I saw it. High above me, broken branches jutted out like jagged bones, splintered as though some giant hand had reached up and twisted them apart. The trees stood tall in Yosemite. These branches were easily 20 feet off the ground. Whatever had been through here was strong enough to shatter limbs that had withstood decades of storm and lightning. I should have left that night. I should have radioed it in and walked away. But something, a sense of duty, perhaps, compelled me to continue my patrol, to assure myself that there was a reasonable explanation. The forest had strange ways, and its shadows could play tricks on a mind alone in the dark. Days went by, and while I tried to dismiss that night as an anomaly, the signs kept appearing. More carcasses arranged in increasingly elaborate displays. I found rabbit skulls lined up in perfect rows, a deer's limbs splayed out as though on display. And then, one evening, I noticed something worse. Footprints, massive and deep, crushed into the earth along the main path. They were human, but far too large, as if some giant, barefoot creature had wandered through, trampling the ground with intention. I thought it might have been a prank at first, maybe someone trying to scare me, but these were no ordinary marks. They pressed deeply, as if some heavy, towering figure had strode through my patrol route. The other rangers laughed it off. They didn't understand. They hadn't been the ones finding those unsettling patterns, hadn't felt that prickle of dread creeping up their necks every time they turned away from the dark. One night, after I'd tried to forget the strangeness and had resigned myself to a quiet evening in my cabin, something outside caught my eye. I barely caught the movement, just a blur against the backdrop of trees, as though something massive had shifted just outside the light's reach. It was only when I peered closer that I saw it, a towering shape, far too large to be any person or animal, lurking just at the edge of the tree line. I couldn't make out a face, but the form seemed human, or at least close enough. But its size, that was impossible. I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, staring at the figure at the edge of the clearing. It hadn't moved since I spotted it, but somehow the feeling of its eyes boring into me was undeniable. A chill washed over me, settling deep in my bones, as though the creature carried the very essence of the forest's ancient, unmoving darkness. My flashlight flickered as if on cue, casting the trees in sharp relief before plunging me back into dim light. I flicked it nervously, trying to restore the beam, but when I looked up again, the figure was gone. A part of me thought maybe I'd imagined it. I was tired. Perhaps my mind was playing tricks on me. But a distant howl broke the silence, a sound far deeper than any wolf or coyote, something that reverberated through the trees, a guttural moan that sent an electric spike of terror through me. I stood frozen, the world around me shrinking into a pinprick of awareness as my instincts screamed at me to run. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in my small ranger's cabin, every noise amplified, every creak of the forest pressing against my walls. I swore I could hear something heavy, pacing around the perimeter of my cabin just outside the door. I was alone out here. The other rangers had their assignments, and mine was the farthest station, isolated from the others. By dawn, the sounds had stopped, but the stillness that followed was nearly as terrifying. The next day, I tried to radio in for backup, but the line was filled with static. I even tried the emergency channel, but the only response was a low crackling, as if something was jamming the signal. I glanced at the trees, which stood tall and ominously still, and I could have sworn I felt them watching, listening, conspiring. I told myself I was losing it, that I'd been out here too long without human contact, but I had no choice. As night fell again, I steeled myself, determined to finish my patrol and keep to the usual routes. I armed myself with the standard-issue rifle, although the thought of facing that thing, whatever it was, with just bullets felt like trying to stop a storm with a net. The woods were silent as I walked, so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. The air felt dense, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. About halfway through my route, I stumbled upon something that made my skin crawl. A pile of rocks, meticulously stacked in the shape of a crude figure, a human figure. I stepped back, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. These stones hadn't been placed by accident. They were arranged with intention, each one balanced perfectly. Then, I saw it again. The figure. It was farther off, but unmistakably the same shape, standing partially hidden behind the trees. I couldn't see its face, if it even had one, but I felt the pull of its gaze, a smothering darkness emanating from it. It seemed closer than before, as if it was slowly closing the distance between us with each sighting. I shouted into the trees, desperate to break the tension, to prove to myself that this thing was real. "Who's there? This is park property. Show yourself." Silence. A low, rumbling growl rolled through the air, as though the trees themselves had issued a warning. The figure stepped back into the darkness and disappeared. My flashlight shook in my hand as I scanned the trees, but there was nothing. Only the feeling that the forest was waiting, watching, biding its time. When I returned to my cabin that night, I locked every door and window and jammed a chair beneath the handle just in case. My body was exhausted, but my mind buzzed with alertness. As I finally slipped into a restless sleep, a noise yanked me awake, a soft, rhythmic tapping at my window. I lay frozen in bed, barely daring to breathe. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't want to look, but something, some primal fear deep in my gut, urged me to turn toward the window. And when I did, my blood went cold. The figure was there, pressed against the glass, its immense silhouette blotting out the moonlight. Its face, if you could call it that, was close. So close I could make out the faint outline of eyes, large and black, gazing through the pane with unblinking intensity. A low growl rumbled from its chest, deep and resonant, shaking the glass. Without thinking, I scrambled from my bed, grabbing the rifle and pointing it at the window. The figure didn't move, just stared, as if daring me to fire, knowing full well the futility of it. I lowered the rifle, and in a flash, it was gone, melting back into the night. In the days that followed, the sightings became more frequent. I'd catch glimpses of it at the edge of my patrol, its form shifting in the periphery of my vision. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was just some trick of the mind, a shadow distorted by the dappled sunlight, but the signs, the ritualistic patterns, the sounds in the night, there was no explaining them away. One evening, after a particularly long day, I returned to find the door to my cabin standing wide open. I knew I had locked it, bolted it even, yet it gaped like a maw, beckoning. My stomach twisted, but I couldn't leave it that way. Clutching my rifle, I stepped inside, every sense screaming to turn back. The cabin was dark, and the air was thick with the scent of earth and damp wood, as though the forest itself had invaded. I closed the door behind me, locking it with shaking hands, and turned on the lights. Everything appeared normal, but a creeping sensation told me I wasn't alone. That's when I heard the slow creak of the floorboards directly above me. My heart stopped. There was no one else out here. I held my breath, straining to hear over the sound of my own heartbeat. Another creak, this time closer, as though whatever was up there was moving toward the stairs. I backed away, my gaze fixed on the ceiling, knowing I was trapped. The stairs creaked, each step heavy, deliberate. The thing, whatever it was coming down, and I was paralyzed, my back pressed against the wall, unable to move, to breathe. Finally, the footsteps stopped just on the other side of the door. I could see the shadow of its massive form beneath the crack. a shape that was impossibly tall, looming, its breath heavy and slow. The handle rattled, and then there was silence. I waited, hardly daring to breathe, expecting it to force its way in at any moment. But nothing happened. After what felt like an eternity, I dared to move, tiptoeing to the door and placing my ear against it. There was no sound, no presence, just the faint smell of damp earth lingering in the air. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed by the window, staring out into the trees, waiting for the dawn. When the first light crept through the canopy, I felt a tentative relief. As dawn brightened the forest, it seemed as though whatever had been hunting me slipped back into shadow, yielding to the day. I'd survived the night, but the fear gnawed at me. I knew I couldn't leave, not yet. I still had a job to do, and some irrational part of me clung to the idea that perhaps if I just held my ground, if I remained vigilant, I might find some understanding of what haunted these woods. Foolish? Maybe. But I had come too far to simply turn my back now. The following day passed in a haze. I stumbled through my patrols, nerves frayed, eyes flicking constantly toward every snapping branch or rustling bush. That night, I tried to barricade the cabin, dragging my dresser against the door and pushing furniture in front of the windows. I was prepared, or so I thought. But as darkness fell, the forest fell unnaturally silent, as if every living creature had vanished. It was only me and it. Sometime after midnight, I heard the first scrape, a soft, grating sound against the cabin's wall, like claws dragging across the wooden siding. My heart thundered as the scraping grew louder, circling the cabin. It stopped at each window, as if testing the barricades. I forced myself to stay still, hands clutching the rifle, eyes glued to the front door. A low thud shook the cabin walls. Something slammed against the front door. Then another hit, harder this time, rattling the frame. My pulse spiked, each heartbeat like a drumbeat counting down to some inevitable terror. Whatever it was trying to get in. The handle jiggled, and then I heard the unmistakable sound of breathing. Deep, guttural breaths that shivered through the door. I pressed my back to the wall, inching away as quietly as I could, knowing it would hear the faintest sound. The breathing stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that stretched for what felt like hours. Then came the whisper, a soft, raspy murmur slipping through the cracks. "Come out!" I clamped my hand over my mouth, stifling a scream. The voice was distorted, a mangled mimicry of human speech, like someone who had never spoken before trying to imitate the words. It was inhuman, a grotesque mockery of language. I felt tears sting my eyes, and I choked back a sob, praying it wouldn't hear me. "Come out," it repeated, dragging the words out slowly, letting them ooze through the air like poison. I clenched my eyes shut, pressing my back harder into the wall, desperate to melt into it, to disappear. But the whisper grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was right beside me, in the room, inside my head. Suddenly the banging resumed with renewed force, violent and frenzied. The walls shook, dust falling from the ceiling as whatever was outside threw its weight against the door. My furniture barricade shuddered, and I knew it wouldn't hold much longer. I had no choice. I scrambled to the back window, wrenching it open as quietly as possible, and slipping out into the night. The cold air bit into my skin, but I didn't care. I bolted, stumbling through the forest, not daring to look back. The trees blurred past me, branches slapping at my face and arms, but I barely noticed the pain. All I could hear was the pounding of my heart and the blood roaring in my ears. I didn't know where I was going. I just ran, hoping that somehow, by putting enough distance between us, I could escape. The forest closed in around me, the towering pines swallowing me whole, their shadows stretching and shifting like they were alive. But then the night grew quiet again, that same unnatural silence that made my skin crawl. I slowed, gasping for breath, and looked around, disoriented. I was deep in the woods, far from any familiar trails, but the terror of the creature seemed to have faded, or so I thought. As I turned to catch my breath, something caught my eye, a shadow moving between the trees, far too large, gliding noiselessly. It wasn't walking, it seemed to drift, as if untouched by the ground beneath it. The figure stopped, and I felt its gaze lock onto me. There was no mistaking it now. This wasn't a creature of flesh and blood. This was something ancient, something that belonged to the forest itself. a relic of a time before humanity had encroached on its land. The figure raised a hand, a pale, elongated limb that gleamed faintly in the moonlight. It pointed at me, and a whisper, carried by the wind, reached my ears. Leave or stay forever. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. The forest closed in around me, the trees bending as if to trap me, to bind me to this place. Panic gripped me, and I stumbled backward, tripping over roots and rocks as I tried to put as much distance between myself and that awful figure as possible. But even as I fled, I knew it was watching me, its hollow eyes tracking my every move. It didn't need to follow. It knew that as long as I was in these woods, I was already within its grasp. I kept running, branches tearing at my clothes and skin, until my legs burned and my lungs felt like they would burst. The trees seemed to close in tighter, their twisted branches clawing at the sky like fingers reaching for the stars. I could no longer hear my own footsteps, only the heavy silence pressing in around me like a weight on my chest. I didn't know if I was moving towards safety or deeper into its domain, but I couldn't stop. I wouldn't. In the distance, through the skeletal trees, a light glowed faintly. My cabin. Somehow, I'd circled back. I paused, my breaths ragged, staring at it. Part of me wanted to turn and run in the other direction, to escape into the forest and never look back. But I knew I couldn't survive out here. Not alone, not unarmed. My cabin was the only chance I had, fragile as that hope felt. I made my way toward it, each step heavy with dread. As I approached, I saw the door standing ajar, swinging softly in the wind. My makeshift barricade had been scattered, the furniture tossed aside as if they were mere toys. Inside, my belongings were strewn across the floor, the remnants of my struggle marking every inch of the space. I stepped inside, shutting the door behind me. The silence thickened, the walls seeming to close in, holding me in their embrace. I listened, straining to hear anything beyond my own shallow breaths, but there was nothing. Only the oppressive stillness of the night. Then I heard it. A faint creak from above, just as before, followed by the unmistakable sound of something moving down the stairs. My pulse thundered, and I felt every muscle in my body lock with fear. This was it. I was trapped, and it knew it. The steps grew closer, each one deliberate, unhurried. I backed into the corner of the room, clutching the rifle to my chest like a lifeline. My eyes were fixed on the stairwell, on the darkness spilling down from the floor above, waiting, helpless. And then, silence. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, staring into the shadows, feeling that crushing, suffocating presence filling the room. I knew it was there, just out of sight, lurking, waiting. I could almost feel its cold gaze on me, burrowing into my mind. A voice, barely a whisper, seeped through the darkness. Leave, or stay forever. I shut my eyes, willing it to vanish, to melt back into whatever dark pit it had crawled from. But when I opened them, I found it standing before me, towering and silent, its hollow eyes fixed on me, unblinking. Its pale, elongated hand reached out, and I felt an icy chill crawl across my skin as its fingers brushed against my face. My vision dimmed, my body growing numb. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. All I could do was stare into those empty eyes, feeling them pull me into a darkness I couldn't escape. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed, caught in its gaze. But when I finally blinked, the cabin was empty. The silence was gone, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. The forest had come alive again. I stumbled outside, the first rays of dawn breaking over the treetops. I staggered to the ranger station, numb and dazed, unable to remember the way I'd come. When my supervisor found me, I tried to explain, to make him understand, but my words felt hollow, meaningless. They didn't believe me, of course. They chalked it up to stress, told me to take some time off, clear my head. But they didn't understand. They couldn't. I left the ranger service after that, left the forest behind. But sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I feel it. The weight of its gaze, the chill of its touch lingering on my skin. I moved far from Yosemite, to a city where the lights burn all night, where the shadows hold no secrets. But every so often, when I find myself alone in the dark, I hear it again. A soft whisper curling through the silence. Stay forever. And I know, deep down, that no matter where I go, it's still with me. The forest, its shadows, that unblinking gaze. I may have left Yosemite, but it hasn't left me. It never will.